Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that good introduction. Can you hear me without this? Is everyone hearing? They said I might need it, but there was some hard of hearing. Well, I probably am more hard of hearing than anyone in here. If we have a question and answer session, which I usually do at the end of an address, I'll have to have an interpreter. That is someone to tell me what so-and-so said. I don't pick up things too well. If I need this, I can use it, but if not, I need my hands free for the mystery bag back here. It says Piccadilly, but don't let that fool you. There's not any food in it. Speaking of food, I appreciate that good meal you served me just now. I have been to the Martha Marston Inn in Abingdon to a special meeting, ate far more than any one person ought to eat. I stopped at the art show on the way home. They were serving some very good food, and I ate again. And then I had a wonderful, wonderful brunch downstairs, supper downstairs. I call it supper. I'm a Southern and I still call it supper. So I had a wonderful supper downstairs. It's a great pleasure to be in your church. I have known this church ever since I've been in Bristol. It used to be right downtown, as most of you know. I have a picture of it when it was down there. One of the finest, I think one of the most beautiful churches that the city ever had. And I did take the occasion for historic purposes of attending the last service that was held in that building in May 1956. I can tell you the last song that was ever rendered in that building. I love thy kingdom, Lord. And it was the first time that I had ever heard that hymn. And it became one of my favorites and still remains today one of my favorite hymns. When Jamie Durden called me and told me that I was to speak tonight, she suggested that perhaps I could give a lesson on early Christmas in Bristol. Fortunately, we have much information about those early Christmases in Bristol. Indeed, we have some information that goes far back of Bristol in the area. The oldest record that I have of a Christmas celebration in the area, be reminded and keep in mind that this was before there was a Bristol. But in the days of Shelby's Ford, this would have gone back to the 1770s, a minister traveling through this land stayed all night there on Christmas night in 1782. And he wrote what was going on that night. He said there were some frolics in the neighborhood. Now, you wouldn't have thought there'd have been any neighborhood much at that time, but he said there were frolics in the neighborhood, much drinking, he said, and revelry, and some dancing, and much musket firing. They didn't have firecrackers in those days, but they shot off their guns. He didn't approve of it, so he wrote a pretty bitter thing about it in his little journal that he was keeping. That's the earliest Christmas I know anything about in the Bristol area. Then before Bristol, there stood on Solar Hill at what is now 54 King Street, a large brick mansion belonging to Reverend James King, who had a plantation known as Mountain View that covered all of downtown Bristol, all out through Fairmont, down Beaver Creek for a mile or two, and over in Virginia for a good way. He had a huge house, so huge that up in the attic, the house was so wide that up in the attic he was able to floor a room, and he made a ballroom of it. And the King balls were known far and wide. People came from the old towns of Abingdon and Jonesboro and the various areas around here to attend the balls at the King home. Now, a little later, you may read a little about this happening in my book. Mr. King, or Reverend King, got what he called a new spiritual perception, and he decided that it was wrong to have dances in his home. And that's the main reason that he left the old mansion on Solar Hill and moved down to a new house that he had built just about where the Melrose Street Bridge crosses from the Volunteer Parkway now over into what we call 5 Points, or near 5 Points. He said that he needed to get away from reminders of the folly of his younger days. And so he left the house on Solar Hill and moved down there, partly because of the noted balls that he had had in his home so long ago. Now we come to Bristol, and this should take most of our time tonight. Let me give you just a very nutshell history of the beginning of Bristol. Bristol is not, or was not, an outgrowth of Fort Shelby. It was not an outgrowth of Sapling Grove. Now these things are in local history, but they're not so. The old fort had long melted into dust before there was any Bristol. Sapling Grove was only a rural post office. The nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away, so that by no stretch of the imagination can we call Sapling Grove a village or anything near it. So Bristol is not an outcropping or not a continuation or an evolution from those settlements, if you could even call them settlements. Bristol is a deliberately planned town. It was put on the drawing board first and became a town by a person's intention, deliberately planned and brought forth. It was planned, put on a map in 1852. I am very fortunate to have one of those original maps in my home. And that was the year that lots were offered for sale in the town of Bristol. Bristol did not have an occupant until 1853. In the summer of 1853, William Rutherford and James Fields of Abingdon, Virginia, built the first house in the town. It was built for Joseph R. Anderson, who laid out the town in 1852. It stood on the southwest corner of what's now State Street and Edgemont Avenue. At that time, it was 4th Street and Main Street, the corner of 4th and Main. I think I can identify it for you to where you'll know the location. On that location now, just above what is known as Right Way Drug, there is a monument to the country music movement in this country. That was the first corner occupied in the town of Bristol. That's where the town began. The seed was sown there, and all of Bristol has spread out so far now, had its pinpoint beginning right there on that corner. There ought to be a marker there, and I'm working on that project right now. It was here that the first building in Bristol was erected. And in that building, there was a large room laid aside or set aside as a store. This would be Anderson's store. It would be the first business in the town of Bristol. A number of other firsts took place there. The first post office in Bristol was in that building. The first newspaper was published in that room. The first city council meeting was held in that room. So that corner is a very, very historic corner. But let us leave the Anderson building now and go to a point about 1 mile east of the town of Bristol. At that point, there lived a Mr. William Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford had a daughter who married a young man, and they immediately moved to the territory of Illinois. They had 2 children, a little girl and a little boy. Some kind of a plague hit the family, as was very common in those days and time, and the father, the mother, and the little brother died, leaving the little orphan girl. It so happened that Phillip Bushong, a prominent citizen of this area who lived on what's now King College Road, far out, 2 or 3 miles, was in Illinois at the time, seeing about getting some land. People were moving out there real fast at the time. He knew these people. He was in the community and coming back to Tennessee, planning to come back to Tennessee. He put that little girl on the saddle behind him, wrapped her in a wool blanket. It was cold weather, and he carried the little orphan girl through from Illinois back to her grandparents' home, here just about a mile east of Bristol. I can show you almost the place where he lived. As time went on, a neighbor of that family, also having a little daughter, was fortunate enough that her daddy went to Paperville one day where there was a store and brought home a red scarf for the little girl. And the little orphan girl, Mr. Rutherford's granddaughter, greatly desired to have a little red scarf. She wanted one so bad. Grandfather Rutherford, being a very kind man, said, "I'll get you one for Christmas." Christmas 1853 was coming up. And so he walked on the 23rd day of December to Paperville in order to get his granddaughter a little red scarf. But alas, when he got to Paperville, the merchant had sold out. He came back home and the little girl cried her eyes out, cried herself to sleep that night. And Mr. Rutherford, being a kind man, said, "I'll do something about it if it's within my power." He had heard that Anderson was to open his store on Christmas Eve, 1853. Christmas Eve, 1853 was a Saturday. And so Mr. Rutherford arose early and walked through a snowstorm. Snow was falling heavily, over what's now Cemetery Hill, and down into the big flat, what then was called the Beaver Bottoms or King's Meadows, and came to the Anderson store hoping that maybe there was a little red scarf in that store for his daughter. But the snowstorm had disappointed and discouraged Mr. Anderson, and he had decided not to open his store that day, but maybe to wait till the first of the year. He took two of his servant slaves and went to Solar Hill to cut wood. But when Mr. Rutherford came to the store and told his story to the very kindly Melinda King Anderson, she was a daughter of the man, James King, who owned the land where downtown Bristol is now. She immediately sent Nehemiah Strange. You'll read of Nehemiah Strange in my book. He was a slave of the Anderson family. He would not wear shoes summer or winter. Anderson couldn't get shoes on him. He would go through snow, ice, and sleet barefoot. And so, sending him Nehemiah Anderson, he split through the snow across the big bottoms where downtown Bristol is now, and waded Beaver Creek barefoot to get up on Solar Hill where the wood cutting was going on to bring Mr. Anderson home. Mr. Anderson came, being a very kindly man, a very astute businessman, a very shrewd businessman, and said by some to be extra thrifty. Nevertheless, he was willing to do what he could to help a little girl have a good Christmas. He said, yes, somewhere in this stock there are some scarves. But he had to go into that icy storeroom and dig among his boxes, unpacked boxes, to find if there was indeed a little red scarf. Well, like a fairy tale, somewhere down in the bottom of those boxes, he found the scarf that he's looking for. Sold for 10 cents. Was paid for by bacon. Mr. Rutherford had brought in a piece of side meat in order to pay his bill. There was more barter than money in Bristol in those days. Well, a proud grandfather, a happy grandfather, took the little red scarf and back over what's now Cemetery Hill he went to the little girl, and as it was, I lost something here, let it go. As it was, now you wonder how I know all the details of this. I happen to know an aged daughter of that little girl. I did. She died in 1956. But anyway, the little girl was so proud of that scarf that she spread it over her pillow and slept with her head on it that night. She had a daughter, and that daughter was still living in Bristol when I came here in the year 1953. My work took me into her home often. We became close friends, and she learned of my great interest in Bristol history. In 1956, I went to Kentucky briefly, and upon returning home, I was told that this lady had sent for me. I went to her bedside, and to save using a dreadful word, shall we say that she was slowly drifting away. But a daughter of hers, in whispers, said, there is something here that Mother wants you to have. And so she went into an old leather-bound trunk in the back of that house and brought forth the scarf. That's a historic item. It's the first time it's ever been shown in public. You're at a historic occasion. It's been stored away in an old cherry chest upstairs at my home for years. The crown jewels wouldn't have bought it the day it was given to me, and they wouldn't buy it now. That's the little scarf that was carried through a snowy day in 1853 to a home east of town, and a happy little girl cradled her head on it that night. Kept it all those years, passed it on to her daughter, and in 1956 said, I want Bud to have this. And I brought it home with me, and it's been a prized object ever since. Little maple leaves, little flowers, and can't you imagine how that thrilled the heart of a little 5-year-old girl. You are seeing the first Christmas gift that was ever given in the town of Bristol. It is further valuable in that you are seeing the first bit of merchandise that was ever sold in a Bristol store. Of all the millions of dollars worth of goods that's been sold in this town since, here is how it began. 10-cent item of 1853. The next day, Christmas Day, was on Sunday in 1853, and the Andersons sent for their neighbors to come in and have a Christmas celebration in their home. Reverend James King was his father-in-law. So, befitting the Christmas season, they said, we'll have a service and then a feast. Reverend James King preached that day a brief sermon. But before he preached, now I might tell you approximately who was there, the Sousson family that gave their name to the Sousson Cemetery, the nearest neighbors of King's, came that day. Some of the Rutherfords, some of the O'Briens, who lived about 3 miles down Beaver Creek, came in to the meeting that day. It was an integrated meeting. They brought their slaves, and the slaves sat in the home with the others and heard the gospel preached that day. In those days, they didn't have hymn books in the pews like we have now. They would have 1 or 2 hymn books, and someone would line a hymn in order to get the singing going. What we mean by lining a hymn, they would read off a line, the congregation would sing. For example, the first song that's ever used in a Bristol service was the 23rd Psalm from this whole psalter. And it's marked. You can look at it afterwards if you want to. Reverend King would read a line, the congregation would sing a line. And so it went. He preached briefly, and then there was a great feast. On page 75 of this book, there are actually 2 versions of the 23rd Psalm. They use the second version. How in the world, Bud, do you know such things? I've been a very fortunate person. A granddaughter of Joseph Anderson. Some of you older people might remember Ms. Herman Blackley. In her younger days, she was 28 when Ms. Anderson died. Old Ms. Anderson would sit for hours and tell her of early happenings in Bristol. And so she told her one day what they used in that first service, and it is marked in this book, and even told the version, the second version, was used in that service. She also told that her husband, Joseph Anderson, was called to lead in prayer, that he prayed for 30-some minutes, and that the main gist of his prayer was that this Bristol that he had founded should become an assembly of upright, noble, and moral citizens that would be a shining jewel in the hills of East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. Now, when you read my chapter in Volume 2 of my work called The Morals of the Masses, you'll see that his prayer was not answered for some time at least. For in those days it was a rough, wild, woolly, outlaw, vice-ridden town. So he had to wait for his prayer to be answered. All right, this little book then pertains to the first Christmas celebration in the town of Bristol and to the first church service that was ever held in the town of Bristol. It passed to his granddaughter's grandson, when he was over 90 years old, told me that, I want you to have this, bud, take it home with you. When we were fixing to move to Kingsport, my little boy tore the backs off of it. We always intended to have them put on again, but somehow in the move they got lost. And so the backs are off, and I don't intend to have anything new put on it. I want it to stay just like it is. As Bristol then grew and prospered, there were many things that happened at Christmas time in this city. People had gatherings, they had dinners just like we do now. Churches had united services for years. In the early days of Bristol, they'd ring the church bell. There were parties, there were dances, there was much consumption of Mountain Dew from the mountains just east of here. And some of those meetings got rather exciting. In 1881, this is comparatively late in early Bristol, there was a dance at the old Virginia House Hotel that stood just across from the present depot downtown. People were there, rather elite folks. It wasn't just a gathering of the rednecks of the town, but rather elite folks. But a redneck did come in to the meeting, and he backed up against the wall and stood there for a while. And after a while, he pulled 2 pistols from his pocket and began shooting under the feet of the people. He said, now this is what he told the judge. I've got the original. I mean, I've got a copy of the original deposition. It's in Abingdon now. He said it wasn't lively enough to suit him. He wanted to see those folks dance a little more livelier, he said. Well, they got lively. He thought it funny, but Judge John A. Kelly didn't think it so funny. He got a pretty stiff sentence out of it for an infraction of the law or peace, whatever they might have called it, in those days of time. I might throw in as a sideline, another man one time started shooting right down State Street just to see the people run, he said. But Judge Kelly didn't think that was so funny either, so he got a little time out of that also. That was the way that people celebrated Christmas, not shooting so much, but the parties, the feasts, gathering around old parlor organs, singing hymns. And one Christmas it was so cold that the mill pond had frozen over down below town. That was the old King, it had originally been the King Mill, the English mill, and it later became T.F. Wood's mill, Bernard, down just below town. And the record in the newspaper says that the people had a grand time skating on the mill pond that night until somebody broke the ice and fell through waist deep, and then they had to build a car and kind of thaw him out a little bit. Now in 1884, a new home was being built on King College Road that still stands. Well, I don't know the number, but it's on the left side, right near Middlebrook, a huge 2-story brick house on the left side. It's occupied by Ann Foley. It was built by Jacob Sousson Carmack. And when Jacob Sousson Carmack was having that house built, he hired a young man who had just dropped into town from North Carolina. Well, the young man, it was noticed he was rather nervous as the people came along the road in wagons, buggies, riding horses, and so on. He would always go behind the house when they passed. Now, Mr. Jacob Sousson Carmack had a brother who died in the Civil War. And this brother had a daughter who was being raised by Mr. Carmack. She was the grandmother of Jim Stone, who lives out in that area now. If any of you know Jim Stone. The grandmother, rather, Mr. Jim Stone. Anyway, she was a nice young girl around the home there. And this man, the nervous man from North Carolina, fell in love with her. And he tried to woo and win her as his wife. And Christmas 1884, during Christmas 1884, he came downtown to the W. James store that stood on the corner of what was later Front Street, now Randall Expressway and State Street. It's the parking lot of the Signet Bank at this time. W. James was one of the early noted merchants in Bristol. His daughter was the lady of the house where I live at 214 Johnson Street. Anyway, there was much to be offered in the stores in those days, so he came down to buy his girlfriend a present. Now these walnut boxes sell for anywhere from $50 to $75 now in an antique shop. I always thought they were made just to put letters or something other in, but not so evidently. That box with key and all, very beautiful walnut, was filled with candy. That was one of the Christmas items for 1884. So this man bought it for his girlfriend out on King College Road. Candy and all cost him a day's work, 75 cents. Box, candy and all, 75 cents, and that was his daily wage. He gave it to the girl, and she liked it. And things might have gone better had not the wrong person come along that road one day. It was the law from North Carolina. He was wanted for murder somewhere in North Carolina. So he left the country, of course, but he left his box of candy with his girlfriend behind. This is the box that was given in 1884. It was made into a sewing box later. There's some rusty needles in it. I don't know when it was made into a sewing box, but it was later. It was refinished by E.D. McLean on July the 20th, 1932. And the daughter of the family who's still living, that is a daughter of the family, of the Carmack family, granddaughter, told me that her mother long used it for a sewing box. And today it's one of the prized objects in my home. That's, if I were a lawyer, I'd say that's Exhibit 3. We have the little red the little red scarf, the beautiful box. I have a weakness for these things. I love these boxes. But now they're about anywhere from $50 to $75 if you buy them in an antique shop. 1884, good candy and all, 75 cents. Now, I'll tell you one more little incident, and then we'll try to bring this to a conclusion. In 1891, young Mr. Alban Hoffman was the son of Dr. J.M. Hoffman, who was one of the early physicians in Bristol. Dr. Hoffman is best known for his medicine that he called Dr. Hoffman's Liver Invigorator. It was sold in Bristol for a long time. He manufactured it, sold it in Bristol. He had a son, Alban, who was far from a doctor. In fact, he just didn't, well, it'd be unkind to say it. He just never did accomplish much. But anyway, he fell in love with little Sarah Laura Brown. But Sarah Laura Brown's mother did not approve of the proposed marriage between the two. So in 1891, he went to the I.B. Dunn store. There's a lot of side notes I could throw in here. The stores in those days knew that half the people couldn't read, so they put special things up in front of the stores to draw attention so they could say, well, this is a store with an eagle, or this is a store with this or that or the other. I.B. Dunn painted as Isaac Baker Dunn of the noted Dunn family in Abingdon, Virginia up here. He painted his store bright red and then hung a big bright red flag in front of it. That's the way you found I.B. Dunn and Company on Cumberland Street in Bristol, Virginia. I.B. Dunn offered a special service. He would sell you dishes and have someone paint on the back whatever message you wanted. So, being that this prospective mother-in-law did not approve of young Mr. Hoffman, he thought that he would perhaps make her feel better toward him by buying her a lovely set of plates and putting their initials on the back of it, and perhaps win her over. He did buy a lovely set of plates. I've never been able berries or cherries. I never saw red gooseberry though. But anyway, there's something on the back of it, on it rather, and on the back it says SLB from AMH. The mother's name was also, sir, and that's how it comes the same initials as his wife, or not wife, proposed wife. He gave this to the mother, prospective mother-in-law, hoping to soften her up a bit. There was 8 places to begin with. Well, love has a way of taking strange angles. You know what happened? Maybe they worked too good. He married the mother instead of the daughter. She was only, he was already 28 or 9. The girl he's trying to marry was 16, and so the mother-in-law wasn't over 35 possibly. But he married her. And they had a family, and one of the granddaughters, 10, 12 years ago, gave me that plate and told me the story that goes with it. That's Exhibit 4 in all the exhibits that I have. This one thought, we're not surprised when Christmas merchandise shows up in the local stores in December, not in December, but in August now. But it was not so in those days. In an old Bristol newspaper that I have at home, there is the apology of E.H. Seneca, who had one of the largest stores here on the corner of, you know where the Bagon place is? That's old Seneca's corner. And E.H. Seneca had a large store on that corner. He put an ad in the Bristol News apologizing for the fact that it was the 21st of December before he got his merchandise out for Christmas. He said, it's always been my custom that I have it out a full week before Christmas. And he missed it just a little. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas. One little word of advice in part. In the Bible, there's a record of 2 men. One was old King Ahab. He got into such severe depression that he couldn't sleep or eat because he wanted something. There was the Apostle Paul, who was in prison, cruelly treated, no doubt hungry and suffering. He didn't write that I can't eat or I can't sleep, but he wrote that I'm full and have all. There's a great difference in those 2 men. And I want you to learn that lesson if you never remember the box, the plate, the book, or the scarf. The difference in their happiness and unhappiness is that one was trying to get and the other was trying to give. Remember that as your 1991 Christmas lesson. If there's a table somewhere that we can put these on, I'll let you have close looks at them at the conclusion of the meeting. Who is the final judge here to close court?
I guess that's me.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Bud, for coming. Do you want to take some questions? Or?
Oh, yes. If we're not running too far over time, and if there's questions, I may need an interpreter. I don't hear very well, and I may need I didn't admit it till recent years, but I don't hear very well. Sometimes I hear things that I shouldn't hear, but nevertheless, if you'll give questions, if anybody has a question, I'll be glad to try to take it under consideration and see what I could do with it.
You might tell us about the book that you have will be coming out soon that's in printing right now.
Thank you for the suggestion. I'll be glad to do that, sir. I appreciate it. I would have forgotten it. I thank you very much for mentioning it. I would have forgotten it, and I know there's many people here who are interested to know when that book is coming out. I appreciate that, brother. The first volume of the history of Bristol, which will cover the formative years from 1852 to 1900. We've proposed 3 volumes, and this is volume 1. Will be out, well, let me not say will be out, because I've said that too many times. But the last time I talked to the publisher, he was hoping for Christmas, but we're too close to Christmas now. I don't think there's any chance that it will be out by Christmas. My opinion is maybe mid-January. But nevertheless, it is on the way. I think the printing is being done now, but they have to send it to Charlotte, North Carolina to have it hardbound. And I have a feeling it's going to be in January before it's out.
Where will it be for sale?
It will be for sale in various places. I think I have a reserve list, and I'm taking reserve orders. And hopefully, I haven't made public issue of this or haven't advertised it publicly, but I hope that I may be able to give you a little discount if you buy direct from me. But he plans to have it first offered in, what is the new bookstore down, Bookends, down on the corner of Moore and State in Bristol. He plans to let them have the first offering of it, but I will have it, and I'm sure it will be in other stores. There should be some maybe notices in the paper. They say they're going to put me on TV. I don't know.
But are there any pictures of the people that you talked about tonight?
In the book,
Well, the book or even in Bristol?
there's Anderson of the store. There's a picture of him. It will be in the book. I don't have a picture of James the merchant. I don't have a picture of Seneca the merchant. There's not a picture of these people, the little girl and so on. I don't have any pictures of those. There will be 70 photos in the book. There's 70 pictures in the book. Now, this book is built around people more than things and events. So I did manage to get the picture of several people. One picture that people said didn't exist did, and I found it. Samuel Goodson, who set up Goodsonville, that was a little burg just above Old Bristol, Virginia, across Beaver Creek. They said there's no photos of him. But I had a hunch, and I followed that hunch, and in an old attic in Kingsport was his photo. It was made 3 days before he died, 4 days before he died. And so I have that. Colonel King, who bought the land for his son, where Bristol is located, of course, died in 1825. And they said there was no, of course there wouldn't have been, there was no photographer at that time, but I managed to find a picture of a portrait. He had had his portrait painted, the original's in Tampa, Florida, and I did get a picture of a portrait. So we'll have his picture as a copy of a portrait. His son, William King, who helped drive the carriage that took Andrew Jackson to Washington to be inaugurated the first time, he also had a portrait made, and I have a picture of that portrait that will be in the book. Incidentally, Andrew Jackson used to stop here with the Kings on his way to work.
Are there any old structures left in Bristol? You talked about any old buildings.
Pardon me?
Are there any old buildings from this area?
Buildings?
Yeah.
Old buildings. Yes, we'll have some pictures of some old buildings. There will be some pictures of old buildings. Now, one of the old photos was so faded that we couldn't get a copy. So I had an artist to draw it. He could get enough vision of it, he could draw it. So that will be in the book.
Did you say there'll be a chapter about State Street Church?
There is a chapter. There's a chapter called The Temples of the Time, which includes the history of the early churches of Bristol. Jesse Adlai played the biggest role in setting up this church, and his photo will be in the book. I do have a picture of him.
I need to comment that the natives are restless outside around the tree. But before you break up, I would ask anyone who would like to pick up a fruit basket to take to a shut-in that lives near them. And almost everybody here has someone who lives next to them. They're outside the pastor's offices. If you would do that, that would help us. And if you all want to participate in the lighting of the tree with your children,
Okay.
this is a good time to do it.
Let's give them.
Bring it with you.
Whatever. Anybody come here?
I've also got him at BB is
And we put it over
All
here.
the other town, this is the last road or something. That's what.
I'd say yes.
Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate you coming. Well, these needles are in there. tore those backs off, and he's still living.
Still feel like whipping.
His father said we meant to put them back on. When they moved from here to Kingsport, they lost them somewhere in the loop. So somebody advised me to put new backs. I said, no, just leave it like it is. Let it stay like it is. So it's...
Somebody told me I should get in touch with you because I have a book that's, I think it was printed in 1804, and I was trying to give it away and I didn't know who to give it to. Plus, I have a lot of newspaper clippings from the late 1880s that are pasted in books that were my grandfather's. And after the holidays, if you want to look at what I've got, I'd be happy for somebody